The man who pulled the trigger believed with absolute certainty that he was saving America. At 12:30 p.m. on April 14, 1865, Washington, D.C. was glowing with relief. The Civil War, 4 years of blood, smoke, and unimaginable loss, was finally over. Church bells rang, soldiers flooded the streets, flags hung from windows like prayers made visible. People laughed again, some for the first time in years. And that night, inside Ford's Theater, the President of the United States laughed too. Abraham Lincoln sat in the balcony, his long body relaxed, his massive responsibilities momentarily set aside. He held his wife Mary's hand while the audience roared at the comedy on stage. He had survived assassination threats before. He had survived war. He believed, perhaps dangerously, that the worst was behind him. He was wrong. John Wilkes Booth stood in the shadows backstage, listening to the laughter of the crowd, his jaw clenched, his heart racing not with fear, but with conviction. He was not a madman in his own mind. He was an actor, a patriot, a defender of the South, a man who believed history would one day carve his name in marble. Instead, history would carve it in blood. Booth checked the small Derringer pistol hidden in his pocket. One shot. That was all it would take. But this story does not begin in Ford's Theater. It begins decades earlier, in a nation already tearing itself apart. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, a place so poor that poverty was not a condition, but a fact of life. His mother died when he was 9. His education, by his own estimate, amounted to less than a year of formal schooling. Yet somehow, impossibly, this tall, awkward frontier boy taught himself law, politics, philosophy, and the language of moral clarity. He learned early that words could shape reality. By the time Lincoln rose to national prominence, America was a country split down its spine. The question of slavery was no longer theoretical, it was explosive. The Southern economy depended on it. The Northern conscience increasingly rejected it. Every compromise only delayed the inevitable. When Lincoln won the presidential election in 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, the South saw it not as democracy, but as domination. One by one, Southern states seceded. War followed like a storm that had been waiting for years to break. For 4 years, America consumed itself. More than 600,000 soldiers died, more than in all other U.S. wars combined up to that point. Towns vanished, families shattered, the land itself seemed wounded. Lincoln aged rapidly under the weight of it all. His face, once soft, became deeply carved with sorrow. And yet, through the carnage, Lincoln held to a vision that many found radical, even dangerous, that the Union must survive and that slavery must end. To his enemies, this made him a tyrant. To John Wilkes Booth, it made him something worse. Booth was born into fame. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was one of the most celebrated actors in America. Booth grew up backstage, breathing in applause like oxygen. He was handsome, charismatic, and intensely emotional. Audiences adored him, women swooned, critics praised his presence. But Booth carried a deep, burning allegiance to the Southern cause. He saw slavery not as a moral crime, but as a constitutional right. He despised abolitionists, and above all, he despised Abraham Lincoln. As the war dragged on and the South bled, Booth grew increasingly radical. At first, he plotted kidnapping the president, believing he could trade Lincoln's life for Confederate prisoners. But as Union victories mounted and the Confederacy collapsed, Booth's plans darkened.
Then came April 9th, 1865. General R.E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. For most Americans, this meant peace. For Booth, it meant catastrophe. 5 days later, Lincoln delivered a speech suggesting limited voting rights for formerly enslaved black men. Booth listened in the crowd, his face pale with rage. "That means nigger citizenship," he reportedly hissed. "Now, by God, I'll put him through." This was the moment, the line Booth could not uncross, except by crossing it. He assembled a small group of conspirators, men bound not by money, but by ideology. The plan was audacious: assassinate not just Lincoln, but Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State Secretary Seward, all on the same night. The government would collapse, chaos would reign, the South would rise again. It was a fantasy. But on April 14th, 1865, the fantasy turned lethal. At Ford's Theater, Booth moved easily. He was famous there. No one questioned him. When he slipped into the presidential box, the guard was gone. The door was unprotected. The play reached its loudest laugh. Booth raised the pistol. The shot cracked through the theater like a whip. Lincoln slumped forward. For a moment, the audience thought it was part of the play. Then Mary Lincoln screamed. Booth leapt from the balcony to the stage below, breaking his leg on landing. He raised a dagger and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He fled into the night. Lincoln would never regain consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. the next morning, the President of the United States died in a small boarding house across from the theater. Secretary of War Secretary Stanton reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation collapsed into mourning, but Booth was still free. For 12 days, America became a manhunt. Posters plastered walls, rewards skyrocketed, soldiers scoured forests, farms, and swamps. Booth fled south, wounded, desperate, yet still convinced he had struck a heroic blow. He wrote in his diary, confused and bitter, that the public reaction shocked him. Instead of praise, he found hatred. Instead of glory, he found isolation. History was not bending toward him, it was closing in. And as Union cavalry surrounded a tobacco barn in Virginia, John Wilkes Booth would finally understand the terrible truth. He had not changed history the way he imagined. He had only scarred it.
John Wilkes Booth rode through the darkness, believing the night itself was on his side. The hoofbeats of his horse were swallowed by the quiet country roads of southern Maryland, roads he knew well, roads that had once carried tobacco and whispers of Confederate sympathy. His legs screamed with pain. Every movement sent fire through his body, but he welcomed it. Pain, to Booth, was proof of sacrifice, proof that he had done something great. Behind him, Washington was unraveling. When the news reached Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, his response was immediate and ruthless. Bridges were sealed, telegraph lines exploded with orders, soldiers poured into the streets. The capital of the United States, barely beginning to heal from war, snapped back into emergency mode. This was not merely a murder. This was a national trauma. Lincoln's body lay in a modest bedroom across from Ford's Theater, watched over by stunned officials who could not accept that the man who had held the country together with words and willpower was now gone. Crowds gathered outside, some praying, some sobbing, some standing in silence as if sound itself had become inappropriate. At dawn, Stanton took control. He questioned witnesses himself, his voice sharp, his memory precise.
He reconstructed Booth's movements minute by minute. The assassin had escaped, yes, but he had left behind clues, names, faces, a web. Stanton understood something crucial. If Booth became a legend, the nation would never fully heal. He had to be destroyed. Meanwhile, Booth crossed into Maryland and reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician with Confederate sympathies. Mudd set Booth's broken leg, splinted it, and sent him on his way. Whether Mudd knew Booth was Lincoln's assassin would become one of the most fiercely debated questions in American legal history. Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, hid in swamps, slept in pine forests, and survived on stolen food and sympathetic farmers. Booth read newspapers describing the reaction to Lincoln's death, and with every line, his sense of destiny crumbled. There was no uprising, no Southern celebration, no historical vindication. Instead, there was grief so intense it bordered on religious devotion. In cities across the North, people draped their homes in black cloth, businesses closed, churches filled, strangers wept together in the streets. Lincoln's image appeared in mourning broadsides, paintings, poems. He was no longer just a president, he was a martyr. Booth wrote bitterly that he was abhorred for what he had done. He could not understand it. He had believed himself an avenger. Instead, he was treated as a monster. As Booth fled, the federal dragnet tightened. Soldiers arrested dozens of suspects, including Mary Surratt, the owner of a boarding house where Booth had met with conspirators. Her arrest would ignite fierce controversy, as she became the first woman ever executed by the U.S. federal government. The hunt crossed rivers and state lines. Cavalry units moved with grim efficiency. Booth's horse grew weak. His own body weakened faster. On April 26th, Union soldiers cornered Booth and Harold in a tobacco barn on the Garrett farm in Virginia. Harold surrendered. Booth refused. "I will not be taken alive." The barn was set on fire. As flames licked the wooden walls and smoke filled the air, Booth stood silhouetted against the light, a tragic figure reduced to desperation. A soldier fired through a crack in the boards. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He collapsed, paralyzed, choking. His grand vision evaporated in seconds. As he lay dying on the porch of the barn, Booth whispered words that would follow him into infamy. Useless, useless. He was 26 years old. Back in Washington, the consequences of Lincoln's death were unfolding with terrifying speed. Vice President Andrew Johnson took the oath of office in a city thick with suspicion. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who despised wealthy planters but lacked Lincoln's moral clarity, now held the fate of Reconstruction in his hands. The timing could not have been worse. Lincoln had planned a careful, compassionate reunification of the nation. He believed in forgiveness without forgetting, justice without humiliation. His absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed anger, vengeance, and political ambition. The conspirators were tried by a military tribunal, not a civilian court. This decision alone would echo through American legal debates for generations. Evidence was presented quickly. Defense was limited. The nation demanded closure. 4 conspirators were sentenced to death. On July 7, 1865, they were hanged together. Crowds watched in silence. Justice, some said, had been served. Others wondered whether the nation, still bleeding, had chosen speed over fairness. Meanwhile, Lincoln's body began a journey unlike any funeral procession in history. His remains were placed aboard a train that traveled more than 1,600 miles, retracing the route Lincoln had taken to Washington for his inauguration 4 years earlier. In city after city, millions gathered to see the coffin pass. Some reached out as if they could touch the man who had freed them. Some knelt. Many fainted. It was not exaggeration to say that America buried its innocence along with its president. Lincoln's assassination changed everything. The Secret Service, originally created to fight counterfeiting, would soon be tasked with presidential protection. Security protocols hardened. The presidency itself became more distant, more guarded, less human. And Reconstruction, the fragile attempt to rebuild the nation and define freedom for millions of formerly enslaved people, lost its most skilled architect. Violence followed. Racism hardened. Political compromise shattered. One bullet had not only ended a life, it had redirected a nation. Yet even as Lincoln became a near mythic figure, his ideas remained dangerously unfinished. The question he had wrestled with, whether a nation dedicated to liberty could survive its own contradictions, still haunted America. In the years that followed, historians would argue endlessly. What if Lincoln had lived? Would Reconstruction have succeeded? Would racial equality have advanced sooner? Would the bitterness of the Civil War have faded faster? There are no answers, only consequences. John Wilkes Booth believed he could control history. Instead, history absorbed him, condemned him, and moved forward, wounded but alive. And the United States would spend the next century trying to become the country Lincoln had imagined.
The silence left by Abraham Lincoln was louder than any cannon the Civil War had ever fired. In the weeks following his burial, Washington felt unfamiliar, as if the city itself had lost its moral compass. Cabinet members spoke cautiously. Generals waited for orders that never came. The country had survived the war, but peace, it turned out, was far more dangerous. President Andrew Johnson believed he understood the South. Born poor in North Carolina, rising without privilege, Johnson despised the Southern aristocracy that had dragged the nation into war. But his hatred of elite planters did not extend to compassion for the formerly enslaved. To Johnson, Reconstruction was not about justice, it was about restoring order as quickly as possible. Lincoln had imagined something else entirely. He had believed that healing required protection, federal oversight, black suffrage, and a slow reintegration that forced the South to confront what it had done. His death erased that plan before it could even be written into law. Within months, Southern states began passing black codes, laws designed to control the lives of freed black Americans. These codes restricted movement, employment, property ownership, and legal rights. In all but name, slavery had been resurrected. The North watched in growing horror. Radical Republicans in Congress, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, had loved Lincoln, but they did not share his patience. They saw Johnson as a traitor to the victory Union soldiers had died for. What followed was one of the most explosive power struggles in American history. Congress versus the president, law versus resentment, justice versus exhaustion. The nation was tired of war, tired of death, tired of moral crusades, and into that fatigue stepped violence. Across the South, white supremacist organizations emerged from the shadows. The most infamous among them, the Ku Klux Klan, used terror as policy. Night rides, lynchings, burned homes, votes erased by fear. The federal government, weak and divided, struggled to respond. Had Lincoln lived, many believed, his authority and moral gravity might have crushed these movements early. Instead, Reconstruction became a battlefield without clear leadership, where progress was made, then violently undone. By 1868, the conflict reached a breaking point. Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives, accused of violating the Tenure of Office Act. For the first time in U.S. history, a president stood trial before the Senate. The shadow of Lincoln loomed over every argument. Johnson survived removal by a single vote. One vote. That margin, so thin it could not be seen, determined the course of Reconstruction. Federal enforcement weakened. Compromise replaced conviction. By the 1870s, Reconstruction collapsed entirely, leaving millions of Black Americans exposed to a century of segregation and systemic injustice. The bullet fired at Ford's Theater had traveled far beyond that balcony. It echoed through courts, schools, voting booths, and streets for generations. Meanwhile, Lincoln's image underwent a transformation unlike any American leader before him. He became something safer than a politician. He became a symbol. Painters softened his face. Writers polished his words. Stories emerged portraying him as a saint, a near mystical figure guided by destiny. His contradictions, his political calculations, his doubts, his early compromises with slavery were gently erased. America needed a hero more than it needed truth. Statues rose across the nation. His face was carved into Mount Rushmore. His words were engraved into marble walls where tourists whispered as if inside a cathedral. But behind the myth was a man who had been exhausted, haunted, unsure. Lincoln had not believed history moved cleanly forward. He believed it bent under pressure, pulled by human choice. His greatest fear was not that he would fail, but that the nation would give up before finishing the work. In that fear, he was tragically correct. The assassination also reshaped the presidency itself. Future presidents would travel with guards. Public access narrowed. The office grew more insulated, more cautious. Leadership became less personal, more institutional. Violence had taught the nation to protect power rather than trust it. And yet, Lincoln's legacy refused to die. His speeches, the Gettysburg Address, the Second Inaugural, were rediscovered by later generations searching for moral direction. Civil rights leaders would quote him. Protesters would march beneath his shadow. His unfinished work became a challenge passed forward through time. In 1963, nearly a century after his death, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke of a dream still deferred. The location was no accident. Lincoln's ghost was there, listening. The assassin who believed he could end an idea had only ensured its survival. John Wilkes Booth's name faded into infamy, a footnote of hatred. Lincoln's words became scripture. History had chosen its hero. And yet, even now, America continues to wrestle with the same question Lincoln left behind. Can a nation founded on freedom truly live up to its promise? That question, unanswered, unsettling, remains the true legacy of April 14, 1865.
Long after the blood was scrubbed from Ford's Theater, long after the funeral trains had passed and the conspirators had been buried in unmarked graves, one question refused to disappear. Was John Wilkes Booth truly alone? Officially, the case was closed in 1865. The assassin was dead. His accomplices were executed or imprisoned. The nation, desperate to move forward, accepted the verdict. But beneath the surface of American history, doubts lingered, quiet at first, then louder with time. Too many coincidences, too many silences, too much haste. Edwin Stanton had run the investigation with iron discipline. He believed speed was essential, not just for justice, but for national stability. The military tribunal ensured swift convictions, but it also ensured secrecy. Testimony was restricted, evidence disappeared into archives.
Witnesses contradicted each other, and Booth's diary, perhaps the most disturbing artifact of all, was not released in full for years. When it finally surfaced, several pages were missing. Stanton insisted the pages were blank. Others suspected they had been removed to protect names, institutions, or even foreign connections. Rumors spread that Confederate agents in Canada had financed Booth. Some claimed the assassination was part of a broader destabilization plot. None of it was proven, none of it entirely disproven. America, it seemed, preferred certainty over complexity. The first massive federal manhunt in U.S. history became a template. Identification papers, reward posters, interagency coordination, military jurisdiction over civilians. In chasing Booth, the government discovered new powers and learned it could use them. These lessons would resurface during future crises. The trial itself became a legal fault line. Mary Surratt's execution divided the nation. Evidence against her was circumstantial, dependent on testimony from men seeking leniency. Even today, historians argue whether justice was served or sacrificed. What mattered most, perhaps, was not guilt or innocence, but precedent. The assassination taught America that in moments of fear, normal rules could bend. Decades passed. The Civil War receded into memory, but Lincoln's death never did. Each generation reinterpreted it through its own anxieties. During World War I, Lincoln became a symbol of unity. During the Cold War, he was framed as the moral opposite of tyranny. During the Civil Rights Movement, he became a promise not yet fulfilled. And every time political violence erupted, the shadow of Ford's Theater returned. In 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated. In 1901, William McKinley. In 1963, John F. Kennedy. Each time, America asked the same questions. How could this happen? Who failed? Was there more we didn't see? With each assassination, presidential security expanded. The Secret Service transformed into a permanent protective force. The presidency became increasingly distant from the public. Fear rewrote democracy in small, incremental ways. Yet Lincoln's assassination remained unique. It happened at the moment of victory. It robbed the nation not just of a leader, but of direction. Historians would later argue that Lincoln's death was the greatest what-if in American history. Greater than lost battles, greater than failed legislation, a single night that altered the trajectory of race relations, federal authority, and national identity. Some claimed Lincoln would have crushed the Klan. Others believed he would have reconciled the South faster. No one truly knew. But everyone agreed on one thing. Andrew Johnson was not Abraham Lincoln. As Reconstruction collapsed, America chose reunion over equality. The consequences were devastating and long-lasting. Segregation hardened. Voting rights vanished. The promises of emancipation were postponed for nearly a century. And yet, Lincoln endured. School children memorized his words. Soldiers carried his image into war. Politicians invoked his name when seeking legitimacy. He became less a man and more a moral measuring stick. This transformation came at a cost. By turning Lincoln into myth, America avoided confronting the harder truth that progress requires constant, uncomfortable effort, that emancipation without enforcement is illusion, that unity without justice is fragile. Booth had wanted to freeze history. Lincoln had wanted to move it forward. History chose movement, slow, painful, imperfect movement. Even today, debates over race, federal power, and national identity trace invisible lines back to 1865. The past is not past. It is present, quietly shaping every argument, every election, every protest. The gunshot at Ford's Theater did not end a presidency.
it began a century-long struggle to define what America truly is. And the story is not finished.
History does not allow rewrites, but it invites obsession. More than any other moment in American history, the death of Abraham Lincoln has provoked an enduring question, one that refuses to fade no matter how many archives are opened or how many biographies are written. What if he had lived? It is not a romantic question. It is a surgical one. It cuts directly into the anatomy of the American experiment. Lincoln in April 1865 was not the man who had taken office in 1861. War had transformed him. He had grown more decisive, more radical, more aware that half measures produced disasters. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, was not a victory speech. It was a warning. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Those words are often quoted. What is less remembered is what followed, a clear demand that the nation confront the moral cost of slavery and accept responsibility for repairing the damage. Lincoln understood something rare in politics, that reconciliation without accountability is surrender in disguise. Had he lived, Reconstruction would not have been gentle, but it would have been deliberate. He intended to keep federal troops in the South. He supported limited black suffrage as a starting point, not an end point. He knew the old order would resist, and he was prepared to confront it. Andrew Johnson was not. Johnson believed the South needed discipline, but not transformation. He restored former Confederates to power with astonishing speed. Men who had fought against the Union found themselves writing new state constitutions. Former enslavers became lawmakers. Violence filled the vacuum. Under Lincoln, that vacuum may never have existed. Historians who study Lincoln's final months note a subtle but critical shift. He was no longer content with simply ending slavery. He was beginning to imagine citizenship, protection, permanence. This evolution frightened his enemies far more than emancipation ever had. Booth did not kill Lincoln because the war was lost. He killed him because the future was taking shape. The assassination froze that future mid-formation. Over time, the loss hardened into myth. Lincoln became a symbol of unity precisely because he was no longer alive to challenge anyone. His absence allowed Americans to admire him without obeying him. That paradox is at the heart of his legacy. In modern America, Lincoln is everywhere and nowhere. His face is on currency. His statue watches silently over the National Mall. Politicians quote him selectively, bending his words to fit incompatible agendas. Few grapple with the uncomfortable truth that Lincoln believed the federal government had both the right and the obligation to enforce moral outcomes. That belief remains controversial. The assassination also reshaped American culture's relationship with violence. Political murder became a trauma imprinted into the national psyche. Each subsequent assassination reopened the wound. Each one carried echoes of Ford's theater. Security increased. Distance grew. Leaders became harder to reach, harder to know. Democracy paid the price. Yet Lincoln's influence persisted, not through power, but through language. His ability to frame the nation as an unfinished project became a guiding idea. America was not perfect, he argued. It was striving. That framing allowed future generations to protest without rejecting the nation itself. Civil rights movements, labor movements, anti-war movements all borrowed Lincoln's logic. Criticism, when grounded in shared ideals, was not treason, it was patriotism. Booth never understood this. He believed violence could preserve a world already collapsing. Lincoln believed ideas could build a world not yet born. History sided with the builder. Today, the United States remains divided,
anxious, often uncertain of itself. The same tensions Lincoln confronted, race, federal authority, national identity, are still alive. They are not failures of history, they are reminders that history is not finished. Lincoln's assassination did not stop progress. It slowed it, distorted it, made it more painful. And perhaps that is the most astonishing truth of all, that one man's death could not destroy an idea powerful enough to survive him. The bullet ended a life. It did not end a vision. America is still chasing it.